I'm going to be talking about my favorite lenses, why I like them, how I use them, and how using and choosing one focal length can improve our photography. In this video, I'm talking about the 28mm prime. In a video I made last year, I said if I had to choose between a 28, 35 and 50mm, I would choose the 28mm. Do I still think that? Yes and no. I'll explain. For many years I didn't give much thought to the focal lengths I was using. I was being sent on trips for publication and brands, traveling around the world doing travel photography, and I took a 17 to 35 and a 35 to 70. They were my two main lenses. After a few years of shooting thousands of images, one day I went through all my archives and looked at the metadata and realized that most of my favorite photos that I had taken over a 3-4 year period or longer were between 26 and 30mm. 28mm was the sweet spot. So I had to think about that and try and figure out why. Why is that? What makes 28mm so special? A 28mm lens allows us to capture a wide scene, and we can fit a lot in and give a sense of place, which for street and travel photography is really important to me. But it's not so wide that it distorts things too much. It's good for landscapes too for this reason. You get a more natural sense of scale and proportion than you do with a wider lens. You can include foreground interest without having background elements getting lost because they become too small. A practical benefit of a 28mm is it's at that point where it's wide enough where you can shoot handheld at a slower shutter speed than a longer focal length and still get a sharp image with plenty of depth of field. When you combine that with a newer model camera with good in-camera stabilization, well, I find I rarely need a tripod. Because this lens isn't ultra wide, there's going to be some times where you're shooting a landscape or a street scene and you're not going to be quite wide enough to get everything in. Can't have it all. I mentioned that this focal length gives you a good balance of foreground and background, but some people may want that wider focal length where there's more exaggeration. Yeah, this is definitely not the lens if you want a more exaggerated perspective. You'll need to look at a 20mm or even wider for that. Some would argue that it's harder to emphasize foreground interest with a 28mm. It's down to how close you move to the foreground. That's probably a video for another time though. My conclusion is the 28mm prime is the best lens for storytelling. And I realize I don't even have one here. I thought I had one somewhere. Where did it go? So is the 28mm my favorite focal length? I said earlier yes and no. I think the answer is yes, because it allows me to do everything I want to do for travel and street photography. No, because there are some occasions when I want to shoot people, do portraits, where probably a 35mm or 50mm would be a little bit more convenient. And that's mainly because with those other two focal lengths, you don't need to be right in somebody's face like you do with a 28mm. And sometimes when you go really close, particularly to strangers, even if you ask permission, well, I always ask permission if I'm going to be using this lens so close, but they can feel uncomfortable. I'll be talking about the 35mm and 50mm in other videos. So you know what to do. Subscribe.